African American recipes no one makes anymore were once the heart of family dinners and church gatherings. In the 1960s through the 1980s, these dishes carried flavor, history, and connection that made every table feel whole. What happened to the foods that once defined us? Ham hock and turnip greens were once the pride of many Sunday dinners, a dish that took hours to simmer but rewarded families with deep, smoky flavor. The ham hock, with its rich fat and marrow, was slow cooked with tender turnip greens until the leaves softened into a savory broth. The potlikker, as the seasoned juice was called, was as valuable as the greens themselves, sopped up with cornbread or spooned over rice. This dish was about patience, thrift, and nourishment, stretching one piece of meat into a meal that fed the whole family. In African American kitchens, it carried tradition, connecting generations to roots of resilience and flavor born of necessity. The aroma filled homes on weekends, becoming a signal that dinner was coming. Though today it is less common, replaced by quicker meals, ham hock and turnip greens remain a reminder of food that required care and time. Families gathered eagerly around bowls of steaming greens, tasting both history and love in each bite. It was not just sustenance, but a symbol of community, where even humble cuts and garden leaves could become something extraordinary through slow cooking and pride. Sweet potato biscuits were golden, soft, and slightly sweet, a comfort food that held a place of honor in African American kitchens. Mashed sweet potatoes were folded into biscuit dough, giving it a tender crumb and a rich orange color that looked as good as it tasted. They were often served warm, with a drizzle of molasses or honey, sometimes paired with salty ham for balance. These biscuits stretched ingredients by combining staple flour with sweet potatoes harvested from the field, making them practical as well as delicious. Children loved them because they felt like a treat even at breakfast, while adults saw them as a symbol of thrift and creativity. They appeared at Sunday dinners, holidays, and everyday meals alike, carrying with them a memory of kitchens that wasted nothing. The sweet potato made the dough softer, the flavor richer, and the result unforgettable. Today, they are rarely baked outside of older traditions, but once they stood proudly at the center of family tables. Sweet potato biscuits were more than bread. They were tradition wrapped in warmth, passed down through generations as proof of ingenuity and care in every bite. Okra and tomato stew was a dish that turned humble garden vegetables into a hearty, satisfying meal. Fresh okra, often picked right from the backyard, was simmered slowly with canned tomatoes, onions, and peppers until the mixture became thick and flavorful. Cornbread was the natural companion, soaking up the juices and completing the plate. The okra brought its signature texture, tender yet hearty, while the tomatoes added tang and depth. This dish was both frugal and nourishing, perfect for feeding large families without spending much. It appeared on weeknights, at church suppers, and on holidays, reminding everyone that vegetables could be filling and soulful. African American kitchens embraced it because it carried flavors of the South while showing the strength of seasonal cooking. For many children, it was their first introduction to okra, tied forever to memories of home. Though today it is less common on dinner tables once it was a regular guest, proof that simplicity did not mean plainness. Okra and tomato stew was hearty food made from the land, carrying with it a sense of history, pride, and resilience with every spoonful. Hog maw, or stuffed pig's stomach, was one of the most frugal yet flavorful dishes to appear on holiday tables. The stomach was cleaned, seasoned, and stuffed with a mixture of potatoes, onions, peppers, and sometimes sausage before being slow roasted until tender. It was rich, filling, and deeply tied to traditions of thrift, where every part of the animal was used with pride. Families gathered eagerly when hog maw was served, knowing it meant a meal that spoke of both celebration and resourcefulness. For many, it carried memories of Christmas or New Year's dinners, where the labor of preparation was part of the ritual. The dish connected generations, echoing practices of making the most of what was available. Though it has largely vanished today, replaced by more conventional holiday fare, it once held a special meaning in African American homes. Hog maw represented survival, ingenuity, and the joy of turning something humble into something festive. Each bite carried both heritage and history, making it more than just food. It was a lesson in resilience, served on a platter and remembered long after the holiday ended. Catfish stew was a Southern favorite, especially in African American kitchens that valued both thrift and flavor. Catfish fillets were cut into chunks and simmered slowly with potatoes, onions, and a seasoned broth until everything blended into a hearty, filling dish. Sometimes tomatoes were added, sometimes milk. But every version was warming and dependable. It was food made for riverside communities where catfish were plentiful and families made the most of what they caught. This stew was practical, stretching a few fillets into a pot that fed many, but it was also soulful, carrying the taste of the South in every spoonful. Cornbread was always nearby to scoop up the broth, and hot sauce often found its way to the table for extra kick. Catfish stew was not fancy, but it carried a flavor of belonging and tradition. Today, it has nearly disappeared from most homes, but once it was a dish that made kitchens smell inviting and brought families together around the table. It was a reminder that food from the land and water could nourish both body and spirit in equal measure. Cracklin cornbread was the kind of side dish that carried a smoky crunch with every bite, turning ordinary cornbread into something unforgettable. Pork cracklings, the crispy bits left from rendering fat, were stirred into the batter before baking, giving the bread a salty richness and texture that plain cornbread never had. It was frugal, using every scrap from the hog, but it was also indulgent, with a flavor that paired perfectly with greens, beans, or stews. Families served it at Sunday dinners, at reunions, and during holidays, where its savory depth always stood out. The cracklings gave cornbread a heartiness that filled stomachs and satisfied cravings in ways few sides could. For African American cooks, it represented both thrift and pride, honoring traditions where nothing went to waste. Today, it is rarely made, as store-bought cornbread mixes replaced the practice of adding cracklings. Yet for those who remember it, the taste is unforgettable, tied to the memory of kitchens fragrant with pork and cornmeal. Cracklin cornbread was more than a recipe. It was a story of resourcefulness, resilience, and flavor that lives on in memory. Red rice was a Carolina Lowcountry staple, a dish with deep African roots that made its way into African American kitchens as both comfort food and tradition. Rice was cooked with tomatoes, onions, peppers, and spices until each grain absorbed the bright, tangy flavor. Sometimes sausage or bacon was added, but the dish stood strong on its own as a filling side or main course. It was a dish of community, appearing at gatherings, church suppers, and family dinners, always bringing with it a sense of connection to heritage. Red rice carried the legacy of West African cooking traditions, where rice and tomatoes were long intertwined. Its vibrant color made it stand out on the table, but it was its flavor and cultural meaning that made it beloved. Over time, it has faded from everyday cooking, overshadowed by faster and more modern dishes. But red rice remains an important symbol of the ties between food and history, reminding families that heritage could be tasted, shared, and preserved with every forkful. It was both sustenance and story, tied together in a single pot of rice. Pig's feet in vinegar sauce was one of those dishes that combined thrift with bold flavor, making use of cuts often overlooked. The feet were simmered slowly until tender, then finished with a sharp vinegar sauce that cut through the richness. The result was tangy, savory, and deeply satisfying, a dish that carried pride and tradition. It was often served at holidays or special gatherings, where its preparation became part of the ritual of celebration. Families valued it because it showed that nothing went to waste and that every part of the hog could be turned into a flavorful dish. For African American cooks, it carried a sense of resilience, proof that ingenuity could transform humble ingredients into meals of meaning. Pig's feet in vinegar sauce have largely disappeared from modern tables, but they remain a reminder of an era when flavor and thrift walked hand in hand. The dish told a story of survival, community, and pride, served steaming on the table with memories as rich as the broth itself. Field peas and snaps were a dish of abundance, appearing often in late summer when gardens were overflowing. The peas were simmered gently with tender green bean pods, onions, and sometimes a ham bone, creating a pot full of flavor that lasted for days. It was simple, hearty, and packed with nourishment, the kind of dish that was always served with cornbread to complete the meal. Families loved it because it was filling, inexpensive, and tied directly to the rhythm of the seasons. For African American households, it carried deeper roots, connecting to traditions of making the most of fresh harvests and honoring what the land provided. The ham bone gave smoky richness, while the vegetables brought sweetness and texture. It was everyday food, but it felt celebratory in its own way, especially when shared among neighbors or extended family. Today, it has faded from regular rotation, but once it was a cornerstone of summer cooking. Field peas and snaps represented the best of resourceful kitchens, where fresh produce and a little seasoning created meals that nourished both body and soul. Hoe cake bread was one of the simplest yet most enduring recipes, a skillet-fried patty made from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. The batter was dropped onto hot cast iron, sizzling until it crisped around the edges while staying tender inside. Some families ate them with syrup for breakfast. Others paired them with greens, beans, or soups. They were versatile, filling, and inexpensive, proving that good food did not need long lists of ingredients. For African American cooks, hoe cakes carried deep meaning, tied to histories of survival, resilience, and resourcefulness. They were quick to make, easy to carry, and satisfying enough to be a meal on their own when times were lean. The name harkened back to old practices of cooking them on hoe blades over open fires, a testament to ingenuity. Though they have mostly vanished from daily life, hoe cakes were once a constant presence tied to both necessity and comfort. They were proof that even the simplest recipes could carry culture, history, and pride in every crisp, golden bite. Hoe cake bread was more than food. It was heritage fried in a skillet. Stewed oxtails with rice was once considered a treasure in African American kitchens, proof that patience could turn tough cuts into tender, flavorful meals. Oxtails were browned, then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and rich broth until the meat nearly fell off the bone. The long cooking released deep flavors that soaked into the gravy, poured generously over fluffy rice. It was filling, nourishing, and comforting, stretching one pot into enough servings for the whole family. Children often fought over who got the largest piece, while adults savored the richness of a dish that was both humble and luxurious. Oxtails were affordable once, which made the recipe accessible to working families. Over the years, the cut became expensive, and the dish slowly disappeared from daily tables. Yet in its heyday, stewed oxtails with rice carried history, resourcefulness, and pride, a reminder that good food came not from expense, but from skill, time, and love. Fried green tomatoes were once a summer staple, a dish that turned unripe garden produce into something crisp and irresistible. Green tomatoes were sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal, seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried in sizzling oil until golden brown. The crust was crunchy, the inside tender and tart, creating a balance of flavors that paired perfectly with fresh vegetables, beans, or just cornbread. Families made them when tomatoes were abundant, often before they fully ripened, making sure nothing went to waste. Children enjoyed them as snacks hot from the skillet, while adults served them proudly at suppers or picnics. The dish became tied to African American kitchens, where thrift and creativity shaped recipes that lasted generations. Today, fried green tomatoes are mostly remembered as novelty food at restaurants, but once they were everyday fare in Southern homes. They represented the ingenuity of turning what seemed unready into something delicious, proof that nothing from the garden ever had to be discarded when a skillet and cornmeal were nearby. Neck bones and gravy were a meal that showed how little could become plenty when treated with care. Pork neck bones, inexpensive and tough, were browned and simmered slowly until the meat softened into the broth. Onions, garlic, and spices turned the liquid into a rich, savory gravy that was ladled generously over rice or mashed potatoes. Families loved it because it was inexpensive yet deeply satisfying, stretching small amounts of meat into hearty meals. The bones gave smoky flavor, and the tender pieces clinging to them were treats for those who knew how to savor them. Children grew up remembering the way the kitchen smelled as the pot cooked, filling the house with comfort. It was a dish of thrift, tradition, and resilience, one that proved flavor did not come from wealth but from patience. Today, neck bones and gravy are rare, but for those who knew it, the dish holds a place of honor in memory, representing both survival and abundance. Succotash with corn and lima beans was once a mainstay at church dinners and family gatherings, a side dish simple yet deeply tied to heritage. Sweet corn and lima beans were simmered together with butter, salt, and sometimes bits of salt pork for smoky richness. The dish was colorful, nourishing, and comforting, a balance of sweetness and earthiness that paired perfectly with fried chicken or ham. Families served it in large bowls, where it disappeared quickly among the crowd. For African American cooks, succotash carried a deeper meaning, linking back to Native American traditions and showing how old recipes survived through generations. It was practical, made from common ingredients available in gardens or markets, yet it held its own among more elaborate sides. Over time, succotash faded, replaced by casseroles and more modern recipes. But once it was a symbol of resourcefulness and history, proof that two humble ingredients could combine into something filling and beloved. It was food that carried both nourishment and cultural pride. Hot water cornbread was one of the simplest yet most satisfying dishes, a quick recipe that fed families when time and resources were limited. Cornmeal was mixed with a pinch of salt, scalded with boiling water, then shaped into patties and fried until crisp and golden on the outside while soft and tender inside. These small cakes were versatile, eaten with greens, beans, soups, or even drizzled with syrup for breakfast. They were portable, inexpensive, and filling, making them a staple in many African American households. The sound of the batter sizzling in cast iron was as familiar as the smell of fresh bread. Children grabbed them hot from the pan, while adults relied on them to stretch meals further. They required no fancy ingredients, only cornmeal and boiling water, yet they provided comfort and sustenance day after day. Though now rare, hot water cornbread was once essential, a recipe that proved survival and satisfaction could be fried into something simple yet unforgettable. Chitterlings, often called chitlins, were a holiday tradition that demanded patience and pride in preparation. Made from cleaned pig intestines, they were simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until tender and flavorful. The dish was born of necessity, when nothing from the hog was wasted, but it grew into a ritual that marked celebrations, especially Christmas and New Year. Families gathered in kitchens, where the long cooking filled the house with strong smells, and older generations passed down the techniques for cleaning and seasoning. Served with hot sauce and cornbread, chitlins became a symbol of heritage, resilience, and ingenuity. They were not everyday food, but a reminder of history, sacrifice, and tradition. Younger generations often resisted them, but for many elders, no holiday table felt complete without a steaming bowl. Today, chitlins are less common, their labor-intensive preparation making them rare, but they remain a powerful memory of family and survival. They represent both hardship and pride, cooked with care and eaten with reverence. Fried cowpeas were a farm favorite that turned a humble legume into a crunchy, savory snack. Freshly picked peas were boiled briefly, then drained, seasoned, and fried until crisp. The result was a side dish that had both texture and flavor, something different from ordinary boiled peas. Families served them with meats or enjoyed them as a simple snack between meals, proof that nothing from the harvest went to waste. Cowpeas were abundant in southern gardens, and frying them gave variety to daily meals. Children loved the crisp bite, while adults appreciated the thrift and creativity of the recipe. It was a dish tied to summer, when gardens overflowed and kitchens found clever ways to use every bit. Over time, fried cowpeas faded as convenient snacks and packaged foods replaced farm kitchen ingenuity. but once they were a beloved reminder of abundance and resourcefulness, showing how even the simplest crops could be transformed into something special. Turkey necks and rice were a dish of thrift and patience, one that turned what many considered scraps into a flavorful meal. Turkey necks were simmered slowly with onions, celery, and spices, creating a broth that was rich and savory. The tender meat was pulled from the bones and served over rice, which absorbed every drop of flavor. Families loved it because it was affordable, filling, and nourishing, a way to stretch small amounts of meat into enough food for everyone. It was especially common around holidays, when leftover turkey parts were put to good use instead of being discarded. Children often remembered the comforting taste, while adults saw it as a dish of necessity turned into something satisfying. Though it has nearly vanished today, turkey necks and rice once represented ingenuity, survival, and the ability to turn little into plenty. It was food that carried both flavor and memory, proof of kitchens where nothing went to waste. Collard green egg rolls were a creative twist that appeared in the 1970s, blending traditional flavors with new presentation. Collard greens, seasoned with onion, garlic, and bits of ham, were wrapped in thin wrappers and fried until crisp. The result was a handheld snack that carried the flavor of tradition but looked modern and fun. They often appeared at potlucks, church suppers, and parties, where they stood out among more conventional dishes. Families enjoyed them because they combined comfort with novelty, giving new life to a familiar recipe. Children were more likely to try collard greens when they came in crispy rolls, making them a clever way to introduce vegetables. Though the trend faded, collard green egg rolls represented an era of experimentation in African American cooking when classic recipes were reshaped for a changing world. Today, they are remembered fondly by those who first saw them sizzling on buffet tables, proof that tradition and innovation could meet in one bite. Candied yams with marshmallow topping were once the crown jewel of holiday dinners, a dish that sparkled with sweetness and warmth. Thick slices of sweet potatoes were baked in sugar and butter until tender, then topped with marshmallows that toasted to golden perfection under the oven's heat. The combination was indulgent, rich, and festive, making it a favorite at Thanksgiving and Christmas tables. Children loved the gooey marshmallow topping, while adults enjoyed the contrast of savory meals balanced with this sweet side. For African American families, it was more than just dessert disguised as a side dish. It was tradition, a recipe that appeared year after year as part of holiday identity. Candied yams symbolized celebration and togetherness, proof that special occasions deserved special food. Though modern tables sometimes replace it with simpler versions, the classic marshmallow topping remains iconic. It was a dish that carried nostalgia, joy, and pride, reminding families of holidays past and the flavors that defined them. Every bite was tied to memory, laughter, and the spirit of gathering. Pan-fried mullet was once a familiar meal along coastal communities, a simple fish fry that turned the day's catch into something special. Mullet was plentiful, inexpensive, and often overlooked, but African American families knew how to bring out its flavor. The fish was cleaned, seasoned with salt and pepper, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden brown in cast-iron skillets. It came to the table hot and crisp, often served with hush puppies, greens, or grits. The taste was both salty and earthy, tied directly to the rivers and shores where families fished. It was everyday food, but carried with it a connection to community and place. Children remembered the smell of frying fish drifting from kitchens, a signal that dinner was close. Over time, mullet became less common as store-bought fish replaced the local catch, but it remains a memory of resourcefulness and tradition. Pan-fried mullet was proof that food tied to land and water always carried the deepest flavor. Boiled peanuts were once a staple of southern roadside stands, a snack as humble as it was addictive. Green peanuts, harvested before fully ripening, were boiled in salted water for hours until soft and briny. Sold from paper bags or jars, they were eaten by the handful, shells cracked open with teeth and fingers. Families made them at home too, filling pots on the stove with the earthy aroma of peanuts simmering away. They were inexpensive, filling, and perfect for sharing at gatherings, ball games, or long drives. For African American families, they carried the flavor of tradition, tied to farming communities where nothing went to waste. Children loved their salty chew, while adults appreciated the thrift. Over time, boiled peanuts became less common outside the South, replaced by packaged snacks, but their memory lingers. They were not glamorous, but they were food of the people, tied to land, community, and the joy of something simple done right. Chicken and dumplings was a dish of comfort, one that filled bellies and soothed spirits after long days. Whole chickens were simmered in broth, flavored with onion and celery, while dough was rolled thin and cut into strips to form dumplings. The dumplings thickened the broth into a creamy stew, turning a simple chicken into enough food to feed a family. It was inexpensive, hearty, and deeply satisfying, appearing often at Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. Children loved the soft dumplings, while adults appreciated how far one bird could stretch. The dish carried a sense of tradition, a reminder of kitchens where flour, water, and care created something greater than the sum of its parts. Over time, chicken and dumplings faded as faster meals became popular, but once it was a mainstay in African American homes. It was food that nourished more than the body, bringing warmth, memory, and togetherness in every bowl. Chicken and dumplings was simple, but it was love simmered slowly on the stove. Homemade Brunswick stew was a dish built for community, simmered in large pots to feed crowds at gatherings, reunions, and church events. The recipe combined chicken, beans, corn, tomatoes, and sometimes leftover meats, creating a hearty mixture that filled bowls and satisfied hunger. Its origins stretched across the South, but African American cooks made it their own, adding flavors and techniques that turned thrift into comfort. Families remembered the sight of steaming pots at outdoor events where the stew cooked for hours until flavors blended into a rich, savory whole. Cornbread was the perfect companion, soaking up the juices. The stew was frugal, using what was available, but it carried with it a spirit of abundance because there was always enough to share. Over time, it became less common to see such pots at gatherings, as convenience foods replaced them. But homemade Brunswick stew remains a memory of community, tradition, and the joy of a dish meant for sharing. It was food that fed not just stomachs, but also bonds between neighbors and families. Peach cobbler with cornmeal crust was once a creative variation on the beloved Southern dessert, giving it a rustic texture that made it stand out. Sweet peaches, often canned or fresh from summer harvests, were layered in a dish with sugar and spices, then topped with a cornmeal-based dough. The crust baked into a golden, slightly gritty layer that paired perfectly with the soft fruit underneath. It was sweet, hearty, and practical, turning simple ingredients into a dessert that carried both comfort and thrift. Families served it warm, often with milk or ice cream, making it a favorite at Sunday dinners and potlucks. The cornmeal crust added a unique taste that tied the dish to farming communities where corn was plentiful. Over time, smoother pie crusts and packaged cobblers replaced it, but peach cobbler with cornmeal crust once symbolized creativity and tradition. It was food that told a story of resourcefulness, turning summer fruit and corn into a memory that lasted far beyond the table. Fried rabbit was once a common meal in farm households, a dish that turned necessity into comfort. Rabbits were plentiful, either raised in hutches or hunted in fields, and they provided meat that was lean, tender, and adaptable. The meat was cut into pieces, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried much like chicken, creating a golden crust with juicy meat inside. Families served it with mashed potatoes, greens, or cornbread, making it a centerpiece of both weekday meals and special gatherings. For children, fried rabbit was often indistinguishable from chicken, but adults knew it as a food tied to thrift and survival. It was resourceful cooking, making use of what the land provided. Over time, rabbits disappeared from most tables, replaced by store-bought chicken and beef. Yet fried rabbit was once a symbol of resilience and creativity in African American kitchens, proof that nothing was wasted and everything could be turned into comfort food with skill and care. Butter beans in ham broth were a Southern staple, filling bowls with flavor and heartiness. Large butter beans were simmered slowly with onions and a ham bone or bits of bacon until they became creamy and tender. The smoky broth enriched the beans, creating a dish that was simple yet deeply satisfying. Families served it as both a side and a main dish, often with cornbread to soak up the juices. It was inexpensive, nourishing, and full of flavor, making it a favorite at weeknight dinners and church gatherings. For African American families, butter beans and ham broth represented both thrift and tradition, turning humble legumes into food that fed body and spirit alike. The aroma filled homes, reminding children of meals shared around crowded tables. Today, it is less common to see butter beans simmering for hours, but once it was a dish that everyone expected to find in the kitchen. Butter beans and ham broth carried history, pride, and comfort with every steaming bowl. Okra fritters were a side dish that often appeared at fish fries, their crispy texture and savory flavor making them a favorite companion to fried catfish. Fresh okra was chopped, mixed with cornmeal batter, and fried until golden brown, creating small patties that crackled with every bite. The fritters were crunchy on the outside, tender inside, with a flavor that combined the earthiness of okra with the comfort of cornbread. Families loved them because they were inexpensive, easy to make, and perfect for feeding a crowd. Children grabbed them hot from the skillet, dipping them in ketchup or hot sauce, while adults enjoyed them with beans and greens. The dish reflected thrift and creativity, turning garden vegetables into something festive and fun. Over time, okra fritters faded from everyday tables, replaced by quicker snacks, but they remain a symbol of gatherings where food brought everyone together. Okra fritters were proof that even the simplest vegetables could be turned into something joyful with cornmeal and a little hot oil. Molasses-glazed sweet potatoes were a recipe that predated the modern marshmallow version, a dish rich in history and flavor. Sweet potatoes were sliced or halved, then simmered in molasses with butter until tender and caramelized. The result was sticky, sweet, and deeply satisfying, a side dish that carried warmth and nostalgia. Families served it at Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, where it provided balance to savory meats and greens. The molasses gave it a depth of flavor that sugar alone could not provide, connecting the dish to traditions of resourcefulness and heritage. For African American households, it was a way to use what was available, transforming staple ingredients into food worthy of celebration. Children remembered the sticky fingers, while adults saw it as a taste of both past and present. Today, molasses-glazed sweet potatoes are rare, overshadowed by marshmallows and syrup, but they remain an important reminder of tradition. They were food tied to memory, cooked with patience and care. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was a budget-friendly dish that turned simple ingredients into hearty comfort. Chopped cabbage was sautéed with onions and garlic, then combined with slices of smoked sausage until everything was tender and flavorful. The dish was inexpensive but filling, making it a popular choice for busy weeknights or large families. Served with cornbread or rice, it became a meal that satisfied without straining the budget. The smoky sausage infused the cabbage, while the vegetables softened into something rich and savory. Children often wrinkled their noses at cabbage, but the sausage made it appealing enough to win them over. African American households embraced it as both practical and delicious, a recipe that stretched food dollars while keeping tradition alive. Today, it has mostly vanished from modern tables, replaced by quick convenience meals, but cabbage and smoked sausage skillet once represented thrift, creativity, and comfort. It was a dish that proved good flavor could be found in the simplest pairings, cooked with love in a single pan. Drop your favorite throwback recipe in the comments. Smash that like if you're craving seconds, and subscribe for more tasty blasts from the past.